All right, I want to welcome all of you to this wonderful November 20th, 2019. My name is Janet Warburton. I work with ARCUS, and I'm excited to be hosting this PolarConnect event on Antarctic fish development. Today we will be hearing from our PolarTREC teacher, Denise Hardoy, and she will introduce her research team that she's working with in Antarctica. For today's presentation, just a heads up on how things work. We will be sharing a PowerPoint presentation. We encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat area, where you're from and what school and how many people are with you. Judy, next slide. And then we'll have an idea of who's joining us virtually. Next slide. If you have questions as we go through, again, post your questions in the chat area. A little bit about what is PolarTREC and why Denise is in Antarctica. She has good fortune to be selected and part of PolarTREC Teachers, Researchers Exploring and Collaborating. It is run by a nonprofit called Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, or ARCUS for short. We are based in Fairbanks, Alaska, with employees across the United States, such as myself and Judy Fonstock, who's in New Hampshire and helping today. PolarTREC is for educators to work with polar scientists and get better at hands-on science and share that with people all across the United States. To date, we've had over 164, actually we're close to 180 now, PolarTREC educators that have been placed with researchers both in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So with that, oh yeah, just a quick reminder, questions as they come up, put them in the chat area, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll also have live questions if time allows. All right, I'm going to turn this over to you, Denise, and I will mute my end and I'll let you just chat away.
Cool. Well, welcome everyone. So happy to have you guys here down at the bottom of the world with us. I'd like to introduce our team first. From left to right, that would be Amanda Frazier. She's one of our grad students. And then is me. And then is Andrew Naslin. He's another grad student. And Dr. Malitz, how do you say last name?
Mandich.
Mandich, I never get that right. And of course, Dr. Anne Todgham. So this is our little team. On the little sign right outside McMurdo. So go ahead and switch slides for us. And the next slide, it shows where we're at in Antarctica. So if you'll look at the map, down towards the bottom, you can see Antarctica is kind of divided into well, not equal halves, but two sections, East Antarctica and then Western Antarctica, separated by the Transantarctic Mountains. And if you follow that mountain range down to where it meets the Ross Sea, you can see a big star there. That's McMurdo. And we're actually on an island. We're not on the mainland of Antarctica, but we are still attached by the Ross Ice Shelf. So that's kind of where we're at in Antarctica. Next slide, please. So I had some things for you guys about kind of some cool facts about Antarctica to kind of get things started. It's an awesome place to be. It's 1.5 times the size of the United States, and it contains most of the world's fresh water. And it has that in the ice shelf that's covering most of Eastern Antarctica. And if it were to melt, it would actually have the sea level rise by about 200 feet. But fortunately, we have a treaty that protects us down in Antarctica. It's not owned by any one nation, but instead all of the most of the nations of the world have agreed to treat it just to be used for science. And so that makes it a really special place. Also, of course, it is the coldest, the windiest, the driest, the highest, and the emptiest place on Earth. Next slide, please. So there are some misconceptions that I'd kind of like to go over about Antarctica and the Arctic, how similar they are, and kind of more about the differences. To start off with, Antarctica is land surrounded by ocean, surrounded by the Southern Sea, the Southern Ocean. In the Arctic, however, it's ocean that's surrounded by land. Of course, Greenland and Canada and Russia and a couple other countries up there. So it really changes kind of the dynamics of the weather and how the seasons progress because of those differences. Okay, next slide, please. So the differences between the Arctic and the Antarctic. First of all, we are on the bottom of the world. The Arctic is the top of the world. I've had a lot of people ask me, you know, to tell me to be careful to not get eaten by polar bears. And that can definitely not happen down here. Every one of you is closer to polar bears than we are down here. Polar bears are up in the north, of course, and we see penguins and seals down here. The north also has a lot more abundant wildlife. They kind of go through more seasons and they're able to kind of sustain more wildlife on the surface than we are. There's very few terrestrial inhabitants down here. No bugs. That part's kind of nice. There's no indigenous people that are from Antarctica. And of course, in the Arctic there are. And we see a very strong trend towards warming temperatures with declining sea ice in the north. And that isn't necessarily the case everywhere in Antarctica. We're certainly seeing that in the Western Antarctic Peninsula because the temperatures are changing there very rapidly. But on the eastern side, not so much. That seems to be holding steady. And of course, in the Arctic, being at the top of the world, their summer is in July, like most of you, and our summer is in January down here. Okay, next slide. Murdo Station.
Okay, so welcome. This is where we are right now. You get a view. It actually looks a lot like a mining town. So you might think, wow, they're living in tents or we're living like the explorers do. We in fact live in a great kind of normal town. You're gonna see on the left side of that slide, there's a bunch of big brown buildings and those are where we live. Just to the right of that is a big blue, bright blue building, and that's where we eat. So that's a very important building for us. And right now there's about 976 this morning of us here. And so there are some amazing people that are feeding that many people 4 times a day, because if you can imagine, it takes a lot of energy to run a town like this. So people are working at night, and most of us work during the day, but there's a big group working at night. And then the science building is a little harder to see, but if you look in the kind of bottom right of the slide, there are 2 sort of mint green buildings, and just above that is a gray building with lots of arms coming off of it, and that's the science building. And Denise and I are in the top part of that building right now. I wish you could see the view that we could see, because we can see the continent from here with the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. And so that's where we are. It's run by the U.S. Antarctic Program, funded by the National Science Foundation, so the same organization that funds PolarTREC.
All right, we are frozen there. Anne and Denise, we do not hear you. We heard you say you are funded by PolarTREC. Sorry. Can you hear me, Denise? Okay. Stopped your video. Denise, can you still hear me? All right. We do not hear you. We do not hear you. And we don't see your video. Sorry, folks. Sometimes the bandwidth has issues. We'll see if they can catch up here with us. Nope, we still don't hear you. So, so yes, this is a good time to chat about bandwidth and how communications are being relayed through a satellite And the satellites are very low on the horizon. So Denise and Anne, maybe try rejoining us.
Can you hear me?
Oh.
Yes, now I hear you. So please mute Denise's microphone, and then we can hear you better.
Okay, here we go again.
Yes, we gotcha. All right, so you left off at where you were talking about funding, same company or same organization funding your science as PolarTREC. That's where we lost you.
Right. So all of us that are down here are part of the U.S. Antarctic program, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. And that is the same organization that funds PolarTREC. And so we're all down here for science. It originally opened as a naval base, and it's now been opened, for almost over 70 years, mainly with the mission of understanding aspects of Antarctic biology, astrophysics, chemistry, all sorts of Antarctic science.
Okay, next slide. So we can't take you outside right now, so I included a couple slides of what it is like outside. This is actually the view from our window, and it's kind of amazing. I go outside every day and want to take pictures and again and again and again of the same thing, because it's so incredible outside. But probably the most incredible thing is what it sounds like when you go out there. Nothing. It's the quietest you've ever heard it. If the wind lays down, you hear no insects, you hear no birds, there's no one talking in the background. It's amazing that it's just so quiet. Go ahead and scroll through the next couple of slides. The next slide is Mount Erebus. Actually, the next two slides are Mount Erebus, which is 12,000 feet, and though it doesn't look like it, and it just kind of changes every time you go out. It looks different, a little bit different weather, and just seems to take on a different personality each time you're out there. It's really quite an amazing thing to see. And it is an active volcano. It has steam spewing out from it on most days. And then close up, this Cape Evans ice wall is probably 2 or 3 stories tall. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't look as impressive on pictures, but it's one of those things when you're there, it's so amazing. It's just the height of it all.
And I'll just add one thing about here. This is one of our main fishing sites. So you can't see this, but behind where Denise took this photo is a fish hut where, we deploy our operations, which you're going to hear about in just a few minutes.
Okay, next slide. One of the things that I didn't really expect when I came down here was the incredible people that were here. It takes so many people. It takes like 9 people for every scientist to keep the station running. And they just all have some really interesting stories and have just been super, super nice. The other thing is, everybody always asks me about what the food is like. And it has actually been really amazing. Food is kind of more than food down here. It's morale too. And so they actually invest more money than you would think in trying to provide us with something that's not only just, okay, but is actually really, really good on most occasions. For example, at Sunday brunch, they will give us something like prime rib and shrimp, and it seems kind of extravagant, but it really has a purpose. And that's building morale here. People get kind of so isolated that food becomes kind of more important than you would imagine. So you can see all kinds of things, everything from a cookie aquarium to desserts on a daily or every meal basis, and lots of choices. So the food is really interesting. Okay, next slide, please. Another interesting aspect of being down here is the transportation. I thought some of my kids would really kind of get a kick out of this slide. We have a lot of different ways of getting around. Probably the one that we use the most is that piston bully. It gets us out to kind of our farther destinations at a very slow pace, but very safely, and can keep us warm at the same time. We could also use snowmobiles to get out there, but they of course can't haul our fish back and forth either. And there are actual just regular pickups here, kind of heavy duty ones. There are some mountain bikes you could use if you'd like, and shuttles. And of course, I think one of my favorite things is that up in the upper right hand corner, that mat tracks. That's a pretty interesting vehicle too. And that's kind of a lightweight vehicle that can go out. And a lot of these, all of the track vehicles, of course, are designed to go out on the sea ice. So they have to be kind of specialized for that. So some interesting vehicles. Okay, go ahead and next slide. And then, of course, it's really important that you stay warm when you're out here. So I've shown some of you guys my extreme cold weather gear. This is kind of what it looks like when it's on. And you can kind of read down that list and realize that it's just a lot of layers is mostly what it is. You can't wear any cotton, and everything is layers. So lots of wool, lots of synthetic, and it's definitely not a style thing. Everything is about staying safe. And so you have lots of layers and lots of redundancy. So you have an extreme cold weather bag that you hope you don't ever actually have to get into very much, but it's there in case you need it, where you have extras of just about everything. And so all these layers are meant at keeping you warm and also preventing frostbite, which is something you really have to watch if you're going out like on a snowmobile or something. And then actually a really integral part is the sunglasses too. Of course, we've got 24-hour sun here now, and it's really, really bright. And you do have to be sure that you're guarding your eyes so you don't get any kind of snow blindness. And so it's important that all those things that I have listed, that you actually wear all of those and make sure that you stay safe when you're out there. Okay, next slide, please.
So now let's tell you a little bit about some of the stuff that we're doing down here. So we work on Antarctic fishes, and what you see on the slide is one of the fish that we currently are working on that's in our experiment right now. And so it's called Trematomus pinelii. It's named after one of the captains of one of the explorer ships, George Pinel. And we study the one that's on the left, that's about 18 months old, so it's very young. And we study these young ones because we think they're actually going to be the most vulnerable to changing ocean conditions. On the right, we have an adult pinelii. This is a picture that was taken by one of our divers just out front of the station, actually. And there, it's a really pretty fish. It's not a very big fish. It's probably 8 to 10 inches on its really, really large size. More often than not, it's around a 6-inch fish. It's found on the muddy kind of seafloor bottom, and it's quite an abundant species, which is why we look at it. So if we switch slides, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things that we're up to. So in general, I ask, in our research group, we ask questions about how good are animals multitasking. So I'm a stress physiologist, which means I study stress in fish. And stress isn't kind of the stress that you might have, like, oh my goodness, I have a test coming up, or are we going to win this soccer game? For things that live in the ocean, stress are things like increases in temperature, or having less oxygen, which is what's hypoxia on your slide. Or maybe it's saltier than it needs to be, or less salty. And so I want to know, how do animals cope with these different factors that are changing? And that's led to the kind of research we're doing down here, where we're looking at the effects of elevated temperature and elevated CO2 on development in fishes. So we'll change to the next slide. And so what I really want to know is a lot about how animals cope with stress from the perspective of energy. And so that's kind of our main driving question. We want to know whether or not they have the energy available to cope with stress and still do all the things that they need to be able to do.
Okay, next slide. So Dr. Todgham talks about it in terms of energy budgets. And, if they have enough calories in order to be accomplished the task that they need to accomplish. And I think maybe you guys could relate, especially our students can relate. If, say, you have recess is coming up and you've got 15 minutes and you sort of need to go get a drink, you want to go play basketball and you need to use the restroom. So how do you prioritize that time? And then what if something happens and say you get out to recess late and you only have 10 minutes instead of 15 minutes? So then how do you rearrange your priorities to decide how you're going to be spending your time? That's kind of what we're looking at in organisms. How do they kind of rearrange their priorities so that they can accomplish what they need to accomplish, their maintenance and things like being able to move around. So that's kind of what we would call their energy budget. Okay, next slide. So this graphic is one Dr. Todgham put together, and I kind of changed it around a little bit to simplify it, but basically what it's showing is what their kind of a balance between their energy supply and their demand. So they get their energy by eating and breathing, basically taking in oxygen and taking in calories. The things they expend energy on then would be maintenance and then activity like moving around and foraging for food. Of course, they need to grow and then reproduce and develop. And then they also should have some that they have for storage. Then if you look on the right-hand side where it's kind of in stressed conditions, say something like the temperature is increased or the pH is different than they're used to, it takes them more to maintain normal. And so then that kind of puts the stress on all the other activities that they need to do, the moving around, the growth, the reproduction. They don't have as many calories to be able to spend on that. And so that's kind of the perspective that we're looking at from balancing supply and demand and sort of how they accomplish that. Okay, go ahead and put to the next slide. So Dr. Todgham has the temperatures and the pH changed in these experiments compared to what normal is like. And so she sort of based that on the 2100 levels, the year 2100 projected levels for pH. And there's kind of a couple of different scenarios that she used. One would be best case scenario. Say we stopped any control that humans had over the carbon dioxide production. We stopped producing any carbon dioxide at all. That would be best case scenario. Worst case scenario then would be, say we just kept going the way that we are right now. And then what would our concentrations of carbon dioxide look like in 2100 if we kept going the way we are? And so that's how she came up with the levels that she's using. And also the ocean temperature is predicted to be about 4 degrees Celsius higher than it is right now in 2100. And so that's what she kind of used to set up the experiment. So those were the variables that we introduced into the experiment. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so the reason that we are interested in knowing how animals are coping with high levels of carbon dioxide is because what is that we are currently at a level in our atmosphere of carbon dioxide that we've never been above for the last 800,000 years. And so what this graph is just showing you is the orange line is kind of what CO2 levels have been doing for the last 800,000 years, right? So they're sort of bobbing up and down. So we do see variability in our atmosphere. But what you can see is that where we are now, which says current, is well above what we've seen before. And we kind of crossed that line in the 1950s. And so animals on this planet are experiencing conditions that they haven't experienced in a million years. And actually, if you talk to a lot of the scientists, they would say the last 10 million years. And where we're projected to go, which is that red line that kind of goes off the slide on the top right, is astronomical compared to where we are. So we're currently at about 411 parts per million, and we're going to get up to around 1,200 parts per million. So we're only a third of the way of where we're going to be in the next 80 years. And so there's a lot of scientists that are really interested in understanding how are the plants and animals going to be able to cope with this change in CO2 that's going to cause things like global warming, which makes not only the atmosphere that you live in warmer, but makes the ocean warmer? How is it going to affect the acidity of the seawater? Because as it dissolves in the ocean, it makes the ocean more acidic. So for all of you, that makes the pH lower than it is right now. And animals like to live at a pH that's, you know, just above neutral. And we're now driving that lower with increases in CO2.
And I think it's kind of interesting where this data came from as well. They're doing ice cores down here, and that's what this is from an ice core that was done, where they sort of dig out a column, they drill a column of ice and pull it up, and they analyze the trapped gas in it, and that's how they get the numbers. So they're looking at actual gas. It's not just a guess of what it was. They're actually measuring what the carbon dioxide level was at that point when the ice was forming. So I thought that was kind of interesting how they get it as well. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so people always ask us, well, how do you mimic future conditions if all we have right now is what we have right now in the air? So what we do is we can take pure CO2 gas and we can mix it through a series of, I don't know, kind of little small pieces of equipment that allow us to kind of approximate what we think it's going to be like in the next 80 years. And so this is our CO2 system here, where we scrub the air of water and we scrub the air of CO2, and then we deliver an exact amount of CO2 into a mixing chamber, which are done by those black boxes. And then you can see there's tubing that comes off of those black boxes, and that delivers CO2 of different concentration. So we have green, that is our current CO2 levels in the ocean right now. And then we have yellow, which is kind of a moderate prediction. And then we have our worst case scenario, which yesterday we were speaking with a New Zealand kids TV show, and they were calling it danger. And so you can think about red being danger, because it is the one that I showed you on the previous slide. It's going to take us 3 times where we are right now. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see what it looks like in our aquarium room. So all that tubing then gets split into this giant spaghetti, and we deliver CO2 gas to these buckets. These are just general buckets that we can pick up at Home Depot, and we can deliver gas at different concentrations into these buckets. And in each of these tanks, so the bigger blue tanks have different temperatures of water. And so we can actually expose animals to these sort of variable conditions. And you can see Melitz, who's the postdoc, she's taking temperatures, and then Andrew is down on the ground there doing some of the water sampling that Denise is going to tell you about.
Okay, next slide. So we have to, of course, collect specimens, and that's where the divers come in. We're fortunate we have Amanda is one of our team members who is diving this year, but we also have divers that's sort of their job. They're science divers, and they're really good at this, and they dive under the ice at minus 1.9 degrees Celsius, and they collect fish for us. You can see in Mandy's hands, she's got a bottle and a bag. The bottle is basically just a float, but the bag is where she collects the fish. Now she just uses just an ordinary aquarium net that's kind of been extended so it's a little bit longer, and she'll go out and she'll see some fish. They have to use their flashlight because it does get a little bit dark to see fish under there. And they use the net and they catch the fish and they put them in the bags. And the bags, of course, are full of water, being under the water with them. And then they bring them up to the surface. And that's how we get most of our juveniles. And then if we need any adults to study, we get to go fishing and just use regular fishing poles and to collect some of them. Dr. Todgham also has available some fish traps that she hasn't used since I've been down here, but they are effective at bringing in some fish using light sticks as kind of the lure to get them in. Kind of like moths come to a light, these fish like to investigate light as well. And so that will trap them in. And it kind of functions kind of like those like fly traps that you have at home maybe, where the fish can go in and they can't figure out how to get back out. So a couple of different ways to get our fish. And then go ahead and next slide. You'll see that, you know, once the divers get the fish, then we bring them up in a bucket, and you can see that we use that igloo to house them in, to get them back to the lab. It is, you know, once you get out on the air, surface temperature is much colder than the ocean is on most days. And so we have to insulate them and make sure they don't freeze on the way back to the lab. So that's how we get our specimens. But then we have to figure out how to get some data from those specimens. So go ahead and switch to the next slide. Oh, perfect.
Yeah, and before
Okay,
I was going to say, before you continue, there was some questions that kind of came up, and I know you're responding, but they go along with the slides. So first of all, there was this, will your experiment project the effects of the increase to CO2 into the species that mankind uses to survive? Can your experiments make awareness about specific species going into an endangered condition? And then what other fish are there in Antarctica? That's come up a couple of times. So if you can respond to those, and then we'll talk about collecting data.
That sounds great. Let me just finish this one post about Allen Hills, which is where the ice core is coming from. But basically, I'll look into how to follow that group, and I'm going to have Denise post it on her PolarTREC blog, which if you aren't following it, she has the link at the end.
Okay.
Okay, and so in terms of CO2, what we're really interested in knowing is how much of an increase in CO2 can they withstand, and when do we start to see their physiology sort of be compromised. And so as humans, we can deal with the CO2 that's being put into our atmosphere. We have no trouble with the way that we breathe and the way in which we balance the acid in our body to cope with the CO2. That's not the same for a lot of the animals that live in the ocean. So the animals that live in the ocean, they're not as good as we are at balancing basically the acid that CO2 puts into our blood. And so these subtle changes that we won't actually really be able to feel, the animals do feel. And we want to know, how stressed will they be? And then that allows us to make decisions at a bigger level and say, okay, this group of species is very sensitive to stress, so let's put a marine protected area here. And that gives us a way of reducing some of the stresses that we can manage, like fishing pressure and tourism and things like that. So that's one of the reasons we do that. There are lots of species of fish in the Antarctic. There's actually 310 species. Around here, we have only about 80 species. So in the Ross Sea, which is kind of the area that the station is near, has 80 species. But I would say on any given day, we might see 7 or 8 species quite abundantly. The rest of them are kind of in other parts of the sound or in the sea, or they're offshore, too far for our divers, or way too far for us to be fishing. And then there was a question about penguins. And so do we see penguins? Well, I have been lucky enough to see penguins every time I've been here. Poor Denise has not seen penguins yet. And so the hope is we're going to go do a nice fishing trip tomorrow quite far. And the hope is that we'll be able to go see some penguins. They're not as easy as you might expect to find. They're going about, their daily lives, which right now is finding their nesting grounds and starting to lay eggs. And so they're not hanging out where we're hanging out. And then another question was the average lifespan of the fish that we're studying. And it depends on the fish, but let's go with sort of 20 to 30 years. But it probably takes them to be about 6 or 7 before they can produce their own babies. And so we're studying them, sort of at about just before 2 years old. We study some that were just born. So they have a long time before they reach adulthood for us.
Okay, and so this slide shows sort of several of the different ways we collect data. There's a lot of different tests that are run, and you can see Amanda is running a respiratory test where she actually puts the fish into these little tubes and is checking their respiration by like how much oxygen they're using. It's not counting breaths like we do in our class. It's a little more sophisticated than that. But then also Melissa is doing a similar sort of thing, but it's really interesting. She puts some tissue into this machine and sort of teases out and opens up the cells so that different chemicals can get into the mitochondria, and she is checking just the mitochondrial respiration, just kind of answering more the question of how the fish are coping with this. Not so much how are they, but the way in which it's being done. And then Andrew is in the center bottom is setting up a behavior test where he is checking to see like where in the tank the fish actually like to hang out. And so he's got video cameras set up, and I've been able to help him with several of those kind of behavior tests to see how the fish are responding to stress behaviorally. And that's been really fun too. So, okay, next slide. Okay, you can do this.
Okay. So this is just the beginning of our research. And so once our field season is over, so for us, we're gonna be leaving here in about a month. We're going to bring a whole lot of stuff back to the institution where I work, which is the University of California, Davis. And the studies will continue. So even though we won't be in the Antarctic, students in my lab will be analyzing the tissue samples. So we have fish liver and fish muscle, and we're going to probe that for how well they're doing in terms of managing energy. We've got lots of videos to analyze, so this is a great way for me to get undergraduate students in the university involved in our research, and they can help us do that. And and our biggest goal is to tell people about the work that we're doing. So for me, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak with all of you this morning so that I can tell you, and Denise can tell you about the cool stuff we're doing. And then we also have to tell the scientific community about what we do. So we're going to write up lots of papers that tell people about the data and what it means, and that will help us to figure out what we're going to do next the next time we get to come down here. And and so what we hope to learn is really sort of what we've been talking about. Can they cope with the changes? Oh, we're going to go to the next slide. Sorry. Can they cope with the changes that they're seeing? And what I'll tell you is what we've seen so far is that if they just have to cope with warming, they're okay. If they just have to cope with elevated CO2, they're okay. But when we put those two stressors together, they aren't very good at multitasking. And unfortunately, with climate change, we're going to see both changes in water temperature and CO2 levels. And so what we're trying to figure out now is why can't they multitask? And is there anything that can be done to try to alleviate some of the extra energy burden?
Okay, next slide.
Yeah, and so, the reason that people ask us all the time, why do we do the work that we do? And the Antarctic fishes are a really good study system for understanding how animals cope with change, because they haven't had to for the last about 10 million years. And so if we can understand how they are not able to cope with change, we can then look to see on species. I see that there are people in Chicago, so we could look in Lake Michigan. There are people from California on here. We can look in the Pacific coast. We can look in the Atlantic Ocean for whether or not species that live there have similar signs of stress, and can we use that to help us predict who's going to do well versus who are the species that we need to protect. And I think we're just going to end with a little bit about Denise, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, okay, next slide. So there's a couple of reasons. People ask me, why in the world would you want to go to Antarctica? Well, I think it's obvious because it's so cool down here. But also, I kind of have some specific reasons that I wanted to be here. I want just to, in general, increase awareness about polar science, the science that's going down at the poles and up at the poles. And probably the most important reason I'm here is I want to bring real science to my classroom. I try and get them out and do science a lot, but it's not quite as authentic as working with a real scientist. And I've learned a lot. I kind of thought I knew what it was like to be a real scientist just from going to school and stuff, but I have learned a lot down here about what science actually involves. And so I think bringing it back to the classroom will be really important for my class and for other classrooms that I'm fortunate enough to have you guys following me. And also, I think, you know, we don't care about something that we don't know anything about. And I think the more people know about the uniqueness of the environment down here and the uniqueness of the species here, I think it will help foster kind of a stewardship mindset that, you know, people care about things that they know about and realize, you know, what we would be kind of giving up if we ruin our world. And so I think it's important so that people kind of pay attention to what we're doing and to what everyone's doing, so that it, you kind of know what impact you're going to be having. If you would like to learn more about what I've been doing, of course, I have my journals. If you haven't been following those, the link is down there. I will continue to journal. I'm only going to be here for, what, like 5 more days. It's going really fast, but I still will post a few more journals. And then I'll also be having some lesson plans. So for your classrooms and teachers, I've been putting together with Dr. Todgham some ideas for some lesson plans that will go along with some polar studies. And it'll probably be a series of like 4 or 5 lesson plans, kind of primarily geared towards middle school, but definitely could be adapted for high school or for younger kids. And then, of course, the PolarTREC website also has lots of lesson plans for all different age groups, for all kinds of different polar topics. And my last slide is just, I wanted to say thank you. There are a lot of different people that helped get me here. And of course, Dr. Todgham and the whole B207, which is our event number team, have welcomed me and helped me feel like part of the team, and that, you know, given me such an amazing experience. And I really appreciate that. And of course, the PolarTREC people, of course, Janet and Judy and everybody in the background have helped made it possible. And then the United States Antarctic program, Elaine Hood really helped out with a lot of the logistics to get me here, which was definitely a bumpy road. And so I really appreciate her help. And of course, the National Science Foundation and ARCIS for paying for it and everything and supporting this program. And I couldn't do it without my San Antonio family. Really appreciate everybody covering everything for me, and my own family, of course, for making sure all the animals got fed and everything was taken care of so I could concentrate on what I was doing down here. So super appreciate all of that and love to start answering some questions. I know you guys have lots of questions already.
Okay, so I can see that one of the questions was, oh, there you go. Go for it.
Sorry, this is Janet. I just wanted to have Judy stop sharing and see if you guys can do your video while we answer questions. So I know there were lots of questions that came up through chat, and you were doing a great job of responding to them. But I'll let you kind of go through them. And
my video?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Are you showing up?
I just lost
Okay, so I'm looking at some of the questions. So there's one from Mitch to Denise. What were some of the ways you're bringing this experience back to the classroom, especially making it relatable and relevant to the kiddos?
Oh, yeah. Coming up with similar things for them to do. I've been working with Dr. Todgham on some lessons and trying to kind of mimic what we're doing down here. So we'll be doing some work with some minnows and goldfish and seeing how they handle stress and looking at a lot of different parameters. But that's kind of mostly the different lessons that I'll be bringing back are going to have to do with what we've done down here. And also looking at analyzing some of the data that we get too, so that they can use the data to kind of build their own picture of what's going on. I think that's really important, that my students not only learn, you know, what we think is going on down here, but to look at the data and analyze for themselves. And I think that's probably the most important lesson that I can bring back, is to look at the data yourselves.
Yeah, so I've had a number of people asking us whether or not there are cats or dogs down here. Unfortunately, no. We all miss our pets. But you could imagine that cats and dogs could bring diseases down with them that would interfere with the wildlife. The neatest thing about our wildlife is they have no predators. So the seals don't have any predators on land. The penguins don't have any predators on land. And so they're not fearful of us. They're not fearful of things. They're, of course, very fearful of orca whales in the water. Yeah. But when they get on that sea ice, they're not scared of us. And so you could imagine that a dog could have a really great time chasing penguins if they were down here. So no, there are no pets. There are no kids down here. You have to be at least 18 years old to work at as part of the U.S. Antarctic program. And I think that's one of the stipulations for most of the science programs down here is that you have to be kind of through high school and then you can come and be here.
Yeah, and one of the questions I saw was, with all that clothing, do I get too hot? And actually, that's kind of been more of a problem than getting too cold. It takes a while to get the hang of layering correctly and looking outside and seeing what the weather's actually doing and knowing how it's going to change, because I actually have been hot more than I've been cold down here. Because I just tend to put too many layers on and then realize that I didn't need that. I mean, you can take them off, but then you got to carry them. So that's kind of been more of a problem. Not a bad problem, but I have gotten too hot.
Okay, so I like this question. So this is a question that says, since it's quiet there, are the vehicles you ride really loud? They are really loud.
Yes.
Everything is really loud. So we ride in what's called a piston bully. You would have seen that on one of the slides. It's a giant tank. And the reason we have that is it has a really long track. And because it has a really long track, it allows us to cross cracks in the ice that can be quite large and totally safely. But it is very loud and very slow. So what Denise is about to experience when she goes home is how different the speed of traffic is. So here we drive things at maybe 10 miles an hour, might be 8. And then of course you get on the highway and it's 60, 65 miles an hour. And I can tell you that feels very, very fast.
Yes, it will be an adjustment in several ways, I'm sure. The traffic, definitely one I hadn't considered, but also the daylight too. It's kind of nice down here. Some people thought it might be hard for me to get used to having 24 hours of daylight, but it's really nice. I could imagine if we had that at home, I probably would never get enough sleep because you could spend so much time outside getting work done. But it's been nice. You know, we have curtains that cover and block out the light. And so when you're ready to go to bed, you close them up and it's dark. But it's definitely daylight all night long. So I think that's kind of one of the most interesting. And the other thing is, you know, today is Thursday for us. I know it's Wednesday for you, but we're quite a ways ahead. And so the communication has been kind of interesting to make sure that we're kind of on the same page because of the difference in date. We're like 20 hours ahead or so, 21 hours ahead, something like that. So that's kind of interesting.
Hi, this is Judy.
Right.
I thought this was a really interesting question. You have a ton of questions coming in, and Anne's doing a great job answering a lot of them. But would the stress tests and other research you are doing be able to be transferred to local keystone species back home? Could we adapt it to some of our more sensitive freshwater fish? I thought that was a good question.
Well, that's a great question. So I do very, very similar tests that we're doing down here. Yeah, so I do very similar types of questions, very similar types of protocols to answer very similar questions down up in California as well. And so we can use these same kind of tools to answer these kinds of questions, which is why it's really fun having Denise here, is that we actually think that there's a lot of these tools that we can sort of optimize to go into the classroom so that kids all around the US can also kind of take a look at how animals are doing by using some of the same tests. Because I think what's going to be really important is that we get a lot of people keeping track of how things are doing. What animals do you see where? What new plants are you seeing? So that we can use that information to know how things are changing. And I think that citizens and school groups and just the public in general can help us a lot with that.
Great. Here's another interesting question. How long will the research continue after Denise leaves?
After I leave. Yes, so we have another month here, and then we've got, you know, basically another 18 months where the National Science Foundation has funded us and gives us money to be able to analyze all the data that we've collected this year. And then the hope is that I get to come back down here in about 2 years and do the whole thing again and ask kind of the next set of questions that kind of continue on from what we found from this research program.
Okay, great.
Okay. So there's a question from my nephew, so I'm going to have to answer it because it's very sweet. So he wants to know whether or not there are any submarines. And so we don't have any manned or person submarines that are down here, but there are quite a number of underwater remote operated vehicles, one of which is called IceFin. And so I think what would be another Denise and I to do is to come up with a few of the resources where if you're interested in hearing more about the types of research, we can post some links.
Yeah.
But IceFin is this super cool robot. They have 2 of them down here. And it has great cameras, and it's operated from up on top of the ice by different people who are driving it. Can take pulls. It's great videos of the fish down underneath the ice shelf that we've never seen before. And so that's just one of the ones that's being used right now. But it's not, there's no one in it. Everyone is up topside.
So 2 quick questions I saw. Are there any sharks down here? No sharks, but the old kind of, I think, and a bit further out, not right where we are. And then someone asked about the sun. Basically what it does is make this huge like ellipse. It doesn't really get that, it gets a little bit low now, but eventually by the midsummer, it's going to be just making a little circle at the very top of the sky. But right now it still does make a big circle around. So you can tell a difference between the morning and evening by where the sun is at, but it never goes away. So,
and I'm just writing a quick note. People always wonder, well, how do you sleep when it's 24 hours of daylight? Well, first of all, you're tired, so you want to sleep. And we have blackout blinds in our dorms, so our dorm rooms can be very, very dark. And for those that don't even like a little sliver of light, they mostly wear face masks to make sure that it's really dark for them.
Yeah. Okay, what else?
We have one question.
Yeah, so someone says, oh.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, there's someone that mentioned it looks like, it'd be fun to partner up and to do research. And I think that's one of the intentions that Denise and I have, is that we're going to sort of troubleshoot some of the lesson plans. And then Denise is going to share the resources to the broader community. And it'll be really interesting because there's lots of species that we can find all around the US. And it might be really interesting to see, hey, this is really easy for us to find in local ponds, let's say. And what if we all do the same experiment and then compare our results between classrooms? That might be really a fun thing to do.
Yeah, there's some models for some programs around us that I would kind of like to emulate too, that instead of kind of reinventing the wheel. Oops. Did we just lose it?
Oh, no, I'm here.
Okay, I'm
you've lost.
reconnecting.
Oh no.
So
Maybe
well,
7:15.
We
I wonder.
still hear you, although there's a delay.
Okay, we're
Okay.
back.
Yeah. So actually, now we've lost you. Okay, hold on, people. Actually, we're coming right up on the hour, and so it's time that we would be wrapping up anyways. I'm going to stop the recording and then let people unmute themselves and say hello. We want to thank everyone for joining us today for this awesome presentation from Antarctica. To Denise and Anne. And recording now.
Stopped it.